Welcome to the Lost Roman Heroes podcast. My name is Matthew.
My name is Matteo.
And together we're diving deep into the history of Rome from its founding with Aeneas of Troy to its death with Constantine the 11th, uncovering Rome's greatest heroes along the way and ranking them.
So please join us on our adventure looking for Rome's forgotten gems, the names lost to time, kingdom, republic, or empire, east or west. It doesn't matter to us. It's all Rome, filled with lost heroes whose stories are rarely told. Listen to us wherever you get your favorite podcasts, iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, or on our website, www.lostromanheroes.com.
Now back to the Scandinavian History Podcast, hosted by Michael Shankman. And long live the Varangians!
Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Shankman. Last time we followed the Swedes as their various wars slowly crept westward from Russia, where they tried to maneuver the king's younger brother onto the Russian throne, via Poland, where they fought Sigismund, who still claimed to be the rightful king of Sweden. Then, finally, in 1630, they reached the Holy Roman Empire. Gustavus Adolphus was eager to join the fighting between German Protestants and Catholics, and in the end he managed to convince both the Council of the Realm and the Riksdag to agree. Today, we'll see if the King of Sweden fared any better than his Danish counterpart when trying to fill the role of the Lion from the North. Episode 87, Pray, Child, Pray. We left off last time just as Gustavus Adolphus and his troops were wading ashore in Pomerania, with a dramatic thunderstorm approaching in the background. When the king disembarked, he slipped and fell on the beach. To people in the 17th century, that kind of thing was a bad omen, and people back then were far more likely to take omens seriously than we are today. That meant that instead of just being a personal embarrassment for Gustavus Adolphus, the incident could become a tool in imperial propaganda as a sign of failures to come for the Protestant cause. But the king thought quickly on his feet, even though he was on his knees in the wet sand, and pretended that he had intended to kneel on the beach all along, and started to thank God for protecting the fleet and letting them across the Baltic Sea in safety. Smooth operator, like Gustavus Adolphus. As soon as he finished this impromptu prayer session, the king grabbed a shovel and symbolically started to dig entrenchments that would help protect the continued landing. Not that the Swedes really needed it. Since the emperor had thought that the war was basically over, few troops were around to meet the invaders. The scattered imperial troops that did show up were easily chased off, but the Swedes noted that the beacons had been lit, sending warnings south that the enemy had landed. The crossing had taken longer than expected because the fleet had been waiting for winds that would take them across the Baltic Sea. During all that time, the large army had been sitting idle, eating all the bread and drinking all the beer that they had brought with them from home. Finding supplies was now of highest priority. The king sent for food from Stralsund, but the result was disappointing. Gustavus Adolphus was furious, and instead he sent Axel Oxenstierna, his trusted chancellor of the realm, to Prussia to drum up some grub for the troops. Like so many times before and after, Oxenstierna proved his worth and managed to secure supplies for the Swedish army. During the rest of 1630, the Swedes slowly broadened their bridgehead in northern Germany, taking control over most of Pomerania and Mecklenburg, the duchies that covered most of the German Baltic Sea coast. Even if many peasants and other people greeted the Swedes and the Lion from the North enthusiastically, that sentiment wasn't shared by most Protestant potentates. The most notable example of Protestant princes who weren't particularly pleased about the Swedes showing up were the leaders of Brandenburg and Saxony, two of the largest and most powerful Protestant political entities in the Holy Roman Empire. They did not want a war on their lands with all the human suffering and financial ruin that would entail, and they didn't want to risk their relationship with the emperor either. They greeted the Swedes with cool neutrality at best, and it didn't help that Gustavus Adolphus' wife, Maria Eleonora, was the sister of the Elector of Brandenburg. The Elector, George William, was still not going to side with his brother-in-law against the Holy Roman Emperor. But some Protestant powers did greet the Swedes with the enthusiasm Gustavus Adolphus had expected. One notable example was the leaders of the city of Magdeburg, which declared it in favor for the Swedes in the fall of 1630 and drove out the imperial troops from the city. They then invited the Swedes to take over. And even though I'm sure Gustavus Adolphus was thrilled about their enthusiasm, this development did cause a bit of a complication. Magdeburg hadn't checked with the Swedes before they acted, and Gustavus Adolphus hadn't planned to march on Magdeburg anytime soon. I mean, it was far from the coast, some 240 kilometers to the south and 150 kilometers west of Berlin. There were also plenty of imperial troops between the Swedes and Magdeburg. So logistically and militarily, it made zero sense to march on Magdeburg. But politically, it would be dangerous to ignore the city. It wasn't like Gustavus Adolphus had many allies in Germany, and ignoring this one city that had declared its support for him would certainly not make other Protestant powers line up to join the Swedish cause. As a compromise, the king sent a particularly competent colonel, Dietrich von Falkenberg, to Magdeburg to organize the city's defense ahead of the anticipated imperial siege. Hopefully, this would be enough to help the city hold out until the bulk of the Swedish army could eventually reach that far south. As I've already mentioned, another problem for the Swedes was supplying the army. Of course, stretching their supply lines all the way to Magdeburg wasn't going to help, especially since the situation was tricky enough as it was already. It had only taken the population of northern Germany a few months to realize the wisdom in the Swedish peasants' insistence that the goat gnaw at the enemy's turf. Because the heavy and never-ending demands from the Swedish army for contributions, food, drink, horses and other supplies soon helped turn the mood among the population. Many of those who'd greeted Gustavus Adolphus as a liberator only a few months earlier were now just wishing he'd go away. The Swedish military command was aware of the rapidly decreasing benevolence among the locals, but they had little choice. The soldiers had to eat, be paid, sleep somewhere, etc., etc. It didn't help one bit that the English, the Dutch, and the French, who had all pledged to send aid and subsidies, were dragging their feet. The Swedish war chest was emptying out fast, and soon the army would run out of money to buy what the locals were increasingly unwilling to sell. But the fall of 1630 didn't only bring bad news for the Swedes. In late August, a message reached Gustavus Adolphus that must have had him punch the air from excitement. Or it would have, if air punching had been a thing in the 1630s. It turned out that in the middle of August, the emperor had decided to get rid of one of his most valuable assets, the commander Wallenstein. Despite the fact that Wallenstein was a brilliant military leader who had won the emperor several glorious victories, he had, for instance, crushed the Protestant revolts in Bohemia and Austria that started the whole 30 Years' War. He was now relieved of his command. The reason for this dismissal, just as the war in the northern parts of the empire was heating up again, was that Wallenstein had many enemies at court. It's true that Wallenstein was a brilliant commander who knew how to win wars, but he also knew how to make money out of them. He had amassed a vast personal fortune by confiscating estates and property belonging to defeated Protestants. He had also let his armies devastate the lands where they passed through, spreading suffering, starvation, and death wherever they went. This made Wallenstein deeply unpopular, not only among the empire's Protestant nobility, who feared and loathed him, but also among many Catholics who worried that they might have to pay a heavy price for housing Wallenstein's troops, even though they were supposed to be on the same side. Many of them also were repulsed by the commander's behavior toward Protestant noblemen out of a sense of class-based solidarity with other aristocrats, no matter what their religion. Emperor Ferdinand was obviously aware that Wallenstein was the key asset in his war effort against Gustavus Adolphus, but he was in a bit of a bind. You see, he was in the middle of trying to secure the election of his son as his successor. Remember, the Holy Roman Empire wasn't a hereditary monarchy, and it was up to the electors to choose the next emperor when the old one died. So in order to ensure the goodwill of the electors, several of whom hated Wallenstein's guts for the reasons I just mentioned, the emperor had no choice but to let the gangly, brooding Wallenstein take his movie villain cape and go. The overall command of the imperial troops was now given to the Count of Tilly. It wasn't a bad choice by any means. Tilly was an excellent military leader in his own right, and you may remember that he had been instrumental in the victory over Christian IV of Denmark when he had tried to play the role of protector of German Protestants a few years before. It was Tilly who had commanded the imperial troops at the Battle of Lutter and Barenberge in 1626, and then proceeded to chase the Danish army all the way back home, occupying Jutland in the process. Tilly wasn't only known for his military capabilities, but also for his strict personal morals and deep piety. That's why they called him the monk in armor. If Wallenstein had to go, Tilly was a great replacement. In a modern army, the switch of commanders might not have had such a deep impact, but the imperial army wasn't modern. It still had one foot securely in the Middle Ages, and its soldiers were loyal not to the cause or even the emperor. They were loyal to Wallenstein personally. It was Wallenstein who had hired them, not the emperor. It was Wallenstein who had let them enrich themselves through lucrative plunder wherever they'd gone. When the troops learned that their beloved commander had been dismissed, many of them just left. In fact, a majority of the officers did. They had a contract with Wallenstein, not with the emperor or this Tilly guy. Some of the mercenaries who had previously fought under Wallenstein even enlisted in the Swedish army. Gustavus Adolphus even offered Wallenstein himself to switch sides and serve as a commander in the Swedish army. But that was a step too far, even for the famously unscrupulous Wallenstein. He chose to retire to his country estate, far away from both the war and from his many enemies at the imperial court. So Tilly had a tough start at his new job. Much of his army had melted away, and he was spread thin over the ground. And the bloody Swedes seemed to be everywhere in the northern parts of the empire, preparing to continue their advance southward. In this situation, Tilly decided that it was of utmost importance to take Magdeburg, the city that had declared for the Swedes, but which still was isolated from the main bulk of the Swedish army. If the city would fall without the Swedes being able to help, that might serve as a cautionary example for other Protestants in the empire who might be willing to betray their emperor and join the invaders' cause. So it seemed that next year, 1631, would start with a race for Magdeburg. Both Tilly and Gustavus Adolphus wanted to reach the city and secure it for their own side. The new year started well for the Swedes. In January, they finally finalized their deal with the French, who promised to pump 400,000 thaler into the Swedish war effort annually from now on. That was no small sum, even though it didn't come anywhere close to cover the total Swedish cost for the war, estimated at 2.2 million thaler per year. But it was about a fifth, so definitely not nothing. Also, the timing couldn't have been better. The Swedish army was basically out of money at this point, but the influx of French cash not only helped paying the bills, but it also propped up the Swedish credit score, making it easier to borrow money to pay for the continued war. At the end of March, with the northern duchies of Pomerania and Mecklenburg safely secured, and with bags and bags of French money, the main force of the Swedish army started off south along the fertile Oder River valley. Their first goal was the city of Frankfurt. And no, not the Frankfurt with all the banks and the huge airport. Confusingly, there are two significant German cities by the same name. So to tell them apart, they're distinguished by the rivers they straddle. The city with the banks and the airport is called Frankfurt on the Main, whereas the Swedes were now marching toward Frankfurt on the Oder. They met little resistance along the route because Tilly's forces were focused on Magdeburg, trying to take the city before the Swedes would reach it. Already on April 3rd, the Swedish army reached Frankfurt. The city had a Protestant majority, but it was held by imperial troops. Around 6 o'clock on Palm Sunday, the Swedes attacked the outer fortifications surrounding the city walls. Several of the attackers were actually wearing their Sunday best, because it was a holiday after all. Besides, this was only a limited attack, testing and probing the defenses. They weren't going to storm the city or anything. But, as the Swedish troops advanced, they noticed that one of the city gates had been left open. In the confusion, the defenders had forgotten to bar the gate, and after having fought off an imperial contingent that desperately tried to keep the invaders out, the Swedes took the gate and the soldiers poured into Frankfurt. What followed was nothing short of a massacre of imperial troops. The defense was disorganized since they hadn't expected any serious attempt at breaching the walls any more than the Swedes had. Most of them were cut down in the streets as they were running back and forth trying to figure out what they were going to do. Even though the population of Frankfurt was Protestant and therefore nominally belonged to the category of people Gustavus Adolphus had come to protect, he gave permission to a limited 3-hour plundering session, on condition that no civilian inhabitants were killed. He did this because it was an ironclad rule in early modern warfare that if a city was taken by storm, even if it was only supposed to have been a beefed-up reconnaissance mission, the victorious storming army had the right to plunder the defeated city. If the king had denied his soldiers what they saw as their rightful prize, morale would have plummeted, a risk he couldn't afford to take at this stage in the war. I guess you've already figured out what happened next. The thing with violent chaos, like a plundering of a city, is that it's very tricky to limit. Once the genie's out of the bottle, it's almost impossible to force it back in. That turned out to be true also in Frankfurt in the Holy Week of 1631. Even though they were supposed to stop after 3 hours, the soldiers kept at it throughout the night. The following morning, the rising sun revealed horrific scenes. The streets were so filled with bodies that it was difficult to move in some places, and the soldiers, eager for loot, hadn't been particularly interested in whether their targets were military or civilian, Protestant or Catholic. It took 6 days to bury all the victims, and many of the bodies were unceremoniously dumped in ditches, more than 100 in each. It was in the wake of atrocities like this and many, many others like it that a German lullaby was popularized, going "Bet, Kindlein, bet, morgen kommt der Schwed," or "Pray, child, pray, tomorrow the Swede's coming." Already on April 5th, as the inhabitants were still burying their dead, the Swedish army left Frankfurt and continued on its way toward Magdeburg. But instead of taking the direct route west, the Swedes took a detour via Landsberg, adding some 100 kilometers to the journey. But Gustavus Adolphus deemed that it was worth risking the delay. The Swedes took Landsberg and turned to direct their full and undivided attention to the relief of Magdeburg. Tilly and his army were also moving on the city from the north, and Gustavus Adolphus ordered the destruction of a bridge that he anticipated that Tilly's army would have to cross. The only problem was that this bridge was located in Brandenburg, and the Elector of Brandenburg, the king's brother-in-law George William, was annoyed by this, since he felt that the destruction of his infrastructure violated Brandenburg's neutrality. And, let's face it, he had a point. And Gustavus Adolphus was only getting started. He wanted to set up his headquarters in Spandau, not far from Berlin, also on George William's territory. The Elector rejected this request, but instead of backing down, the King of Sweden informed him that he had 2 choices. Either hand Spandau over voluntarily, or watch the Swedes take it by force. George William relented and agreed to let his brother-in-law set up camp in Spandau. Now, on May 8th, Gustavus Adolphus was finally ready to march on Magdeburg. The shortest route there would lead the Swedes across the bridge over Elbe at Dessau, the same bridge that Christian IV's army had tried to pass a few years before. Remember how that went? Nonetheless, that was the most direct way across the river, so that's where Gustavus Adolphus wanted to go. The only problem was that Dessau was situated in Saxony, that other large and powerful Protestant principality that, just like Brandenburg, had kept its distance to the Swedes after the invasion. Just like George William, the Elector of Saxony, John George, refused the Swedes' request to pass through his lands. The Elector of Saxony was a multifaceted man. On the one hand, he was earnest, serious, wise, and a lover of peace. But on the other, he was a dull drunkard who was more interested in hunting than politics. Still, he had 40,000 soldiers at his disposal, and that was a force Gustavus Adolphus didn't want to have as his enemies, if he could avoid it. So in the end, the king actually backed down and chose to take a detour around Saxony in order not to anger the Elector. That was bad news for the defenders of Magdeburg. By now, the city was not in good shape. The siege was starting to take its toll, and it was getting increasingly difficult to keep the imperial troops out, not least since they were increasing in numbers. Since mid-April, there was an army of 25,000 soldiers besieging the city, which was about 10 times as many as the defenders. Enthusiasm for the Swedish cause was rapidly dissipating. In the beginning of May, Tilly had initiated negotiations to secure Magdeburg's surrender. He was worried that his army wouldn't be able to capture the city and bring it back into the imperial fold before the arrival of the Swedes, even though they were taking their sweet time to get there. By May 19th, the negotiations still hadn't led anywhere until he decided he couldn't wait any longer. The Swedes were approaching, so he started to plan for a final attempt to take the city by storm, unless it surrendered unconditionally. The town council actually agreed to surrender, but the Swedish commander sent to prop up Magdeburg's defense played for time, trying to postpone the decision, hoping that the Swedish army would show up on the horizon at the very last moment to save the day. But Tilly had had enough. Even though his negotiating team was still in Magdeburg awaiting the town council's final decision, the commander of the imperial army ordered the final assault to begin. The defenders had to scramble to man their positions, as they hadn't expected any attack as long as the talks were still going on. Even though they fought fiercely to keep Tilly's troops out, they only managed to keep them at bay for 3 hours before the walls were breached. Even in the 30 Years' War, known for its brutal atrocities, the sacking of Magdeburg has gone down as an especially horrendous affair. Tilly's soldiers were hungry, both for food and for loot. Once they had forced their way into the city, nothing could stop them. They killed anyone they came across, even including a contingent of the city's Catholic minority who had come out to greet them as liberators. Some other terrified inhabitants sought shelter in a church, which, according to the customs of the time, should be a protected safe haven. But the imperial soldiers nailed the doors shut, then threw torches through the windows, burning the church and everyone sheltering inside. In the end, the whole city was set on fire, and it burned to the ground. Before the siege, 30,000 people had lived in Magdeburg. Less than a third survived the sacking. There were so many dead that the survivors had no choice but to dump the charred corpses in the river Elbe. Still, it took them a fortnight to clear out all the bodies. The surviving Protestant inhabitants were taken prisoner, and only let go if they could pay their release. Those who couldn't afford to pay the ransom were forced to remain with the imperial army. They were, in the words of the Swedish historian Peter Englund, slaves dressed up as servants. The fate of Magdeburg, and especially its Protestant population, shook many Germans to their core. Many Protestant princes and potentates who had been unwilling to ally themselves with the invading Swedes now flocked to Gustavus Adolphus as the news spread. They were fearful of what the seemingly unhinged imperial troops may do to them. Among the most notable new allies were Hesse-Kassel and Brandenburg, even though George William's decision to join the Swedish side may have been helped by Gustavus Adolphus arranging a battery of Swedish artillery pointing at the Elector's palace while he was mulling over whether to join their cause or not. So the capture of Magdeburg turned out to be something of a Pyrrhic victory for Tilly. And then, when he was forced to venture into Saxony to find food for his troops, the previously firmly neutral Elector John George, the hunting drunkard, also chose to side with the Swedes. That meant that the combined Saxon and Swedish army was now larger than Tilly's. But it was two very different armies that united. The Saxon soldiers were mostly freshly recruited mercenaries, and they were an impressive bunch. Tall, strong, healthy, dressed in pristine uniforms and with gleaming, well-polished weapons. Their officers were Saxon nobles in new, shiny armor and dramatic cloaks. One Swede who saw them quipped that they looked like they'd gathered to have their portraits painted, not to go to war. The Swedish troops, on the other hand, were thin and dirty, with well-worn, sometimes threadbare clothes, with only twigs in their hats as a sign that they were fighting on the same side. No uniforms here. The Saxons thought they looked more like kitchen servants than actual soldiers. But now these two different armies were supposed to fight side by side. When the approaching Swedish army heard about the fate of Magdeburg, the king decided to turn around and return to the river Oder. He feared that Tilly would use the troops freed up from besieging the hapless city and send them to hunt down the Swedes instead. But he needn't have worried. Tilly was afraid of moving too far east, because to the west, the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel, William V, was now raising an army to join the Swedes. Tilly did not want this new force attacking him from the rear and thus risking being caught between them and the Swedes. To avoid this risk, Tilly chose to march north, to meet up with the reinforcement from the Catholic League and Spanish troops who had been fighting the Dutch. This cautious approach gave Gustavus Adolphus the opportunity to pick off lower-hanging fruit in the shape of weaker, less significant Catholic units. During these battles, the king lived his best life, fighting in the front lines. At least once he put himself in real danger, leading a cavalry charge with only 300 men into the center of an enemy regiment. The charge was successful and the enemy scattered, but the king was surrounded and only escaped thanks to a quick-thinking underling and the fact that none of the imperial soldiers facing him recognized the King of Sweden in time. None of these victories was particularly impressive in itself, but taken together they created an impression of an unstoppable wave of Swedish triumph sweeping the land. This, combined with the horror stories from Magdeburg, helped secure support for the Swedes among German Protestants. But just because Tilly didn't go after the Swedes, that didn't mean he remained passive. Still, instead of focus on the war at hand, he spent his time implementing the immensely unpopular Edict of Restitution, the emperor's decision to give back half a century's worth of lost property to the Catholic Church. The decision to focus on enforcing the edict at this critical point not only meant that he had to divide his army, sending them out on repo missions, it also drove even more Protestants into the arms of the Swedes. That way, Tilly missed his chance of chasing the Swedes away after the fall of Magdeburg. Instead, Gustavus Adolphus had the opportunity to meet with the Landgrave William of Hesse-Kassel. They struck a deal that the city of Weimar also joined. According to the agreement, they would be allies, and as such, Hesse-Kassel and Weimar promised not to cooperate with the emperor. In exchange, the King of Sweden pledged to protect them from the imperial forces. This was, of course, unacceptable to the emperor. Tilly made it very clear to Landgrave William that he must disband his army and submit to imperial authority. When William refused, Tilly sent his forces into Hesse-Kassel, not primarily to fight a battle, but to cause as much damage as humanly possible. But that didn't break the Landgrave's resolve, and after a while, Tilly had to move on. He had orders to continue his voyage of destruction into Saxon territory in order to force the Elector John George to abandon his alliance with the Swedes. In early September, Tilly crossed the border into Saxony and plundered and pillaged his way throughout the principality in the direction of the city of Leipzig. On September 8th, Tilly and his army arrived at Leipzig, where the Elector resided. The imperial commander demanded that the city provide his forces with supplies and that the large Saxon army be disbanded or put under his command. The Elector wasn't at home at the time. Maybe he was out hunting, who knows. It doesn't matter where he was. The point is that maybe the peace-loving prince might have lost his nerve and caved to Tilly's ultimatum, if he had been around. But he wasn't, and the people of Leipzig refused all Tilly's demands. In response, the imperial army devastated the land surrounding the city, before returning to repeat their request for supplies. But once again, they were met with a blunt refusal. Tilly decided that the city needed to be taught a lesson, so he ordered his soldiers to start preparing for a siege, digging trenches and fortifying a number of heights controlling the roads leading to and from Leipzig. He was especially concerned about the northeast, worrying that a Swedish rescue force may appear from that direction. But his caution was unnecessary. When the townspeople understood that they were to be put under a proper siege, perhaps with the fate of Magdeburg fresh in their memory, they relented. On September 16th, Leipzig surrendered to Tilly and promised to pay him 400,000 florins if they were be spared. Tilly was mighty pleased and agreed to the terms, but he had hardly had time to occupy the city before he received news that Gustavus Adolphus was approaching at the head of the combined Swedish-Saxon army. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast, and maybe even picked up a few tips about how not to behave if you want to win hearts and minds during a religious civil war. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal, accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as "Wake up early if you want another man's land or life," "Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies," or "Speak useful words or be silent." Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop or if you just crave more content, at least vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.